It was the sort of autumn morning in the 100-acre wood when everything smelled of endings. The leaves had gone from gold to brown, and the brown ones had begun to let go of their branches with a quiet dignity that Rabbit found, frankly, irresponsible. There was work to be done before winter, and the trees were just standing there. Rabbit had been making lists since Tuesday. He had a list of things that needed doing, a list of things that needed doing first, and a third list explaining why the first two lists were organized in the correct order. He had sharpened his pencil twice and was considering a third sharpening when he looked out his window and saw, with a familiar tightening in his chest, the state of the wood. Pooh's honey pots were stacked in no discernible pattern outside his front door, some with lids and some without, one of them being used, incomprehensibly, as a hat by Piglet, who was visiting. Owl's tree had a branch that had been threatening to fall since August and had still not been attended to, because Owl maintained that it added character. And Eeyore's house, if one could call it a house, leaned against a thistle patch at the edge of the meadow, like something that had given up.
"Someone,"
said Rabbit to no one,
"has to do something."
He said this with the particular emphasis of someone who already knew that the someone was him and the something was everything. He collected his lists, his pencil, and a basket of carrots for sustaining energy, and set out to put the 100-acre wood in order before the first frost. He began with Pooh.
"Pooh,"
he said, standing in Pooh's doorway with the air of a doctor delivering a diagnosis.
"your honey stores are a disaster."
"Are they?"
said Pooh, looking at his pots with mild interest, as though seeing them for the first time.
"I thought they were honey."
"They are honey that will freeze, Pooh. Honey that will crystallize. Honey that will be completely useless to you by January because you've left it out in the open air without any system whatsoever."
Rabbit was already moving pots.
"This one is half empty. This one has a leaf in it. This one... Pooh, is this one full of rain?"
"I think that one might be a bird bath,"
said Pooh thoughtfully. Rabbit closed his eyes. He breathed. He moved the bird bath pot to one side and began reorganizing the remaining stores by volume, moving the largest pots to the back of Pooh's pantry and the smaller ones to the front, muttering about ventilation and temperature gradients and something called first in, first out, that Pooh did not follow, but nodded along to because Rabbit seemed to need him to. When Rabbit left, Pooh looked at his pantry. Everything was very neat. He could not remember where anything was.
"Oh, bother,"
said Pooh. Rabbit moved on to Piglet.
"Your windows,"
said Rabbit.
"My windows?"
said Piglet, who had been sweeping his front step and was not prepared for visitors who arrived mid-sentence.
"They need sealing. The gaps around the frames are wide enough to let in a draft. And a draft in January is the difference between a cold night and a very cold night. I brought putty."
Rabbit held up a tin.
"I'll do the south-facing ones. You do the north."
Piglet took the tin. He did not know which direction north was, but he did not say so, because Rabbit had already disappeared around the side of the house. Piglet stood there for a moment, holding the putty, feeling the particular smallness that comes from being helped by someone who doesn't notice you haven't said yes. He began putting putty around his kitchen window, because that was the one he could reach, and because it seemed easier than explaining. Rabbit arrived at Owl's tree, looked at the dangerous branch, and said,
"That needs to come down."
"Nonsense,"
said Owl.
"That branch has been in my family for generations."
"It has been in your tree,"
Rabbit said.
"for generations, which is exactly the problem. One good wind, and it comes through someone's roof. I'll arrange for it to be trimmed."
"You will do no such thing,"
said Owl, with what he considered great dignity.
"The branch stays."
Rabbit left Owl's tree with the particular expression of someone adding a name to an internal list titled, "People who will regret not listening to me." Then he came to Eeyore's house. It was, in fairness, not much of a house. It had never been much of a house. Eeyore's home existed in a state of perpetual, almost collapse, a leaning arrangement of sticks and bark propped against each other with what appeared to be optimism and very little else. One wall was shorter than the other. The roof had a gap in it that Eeyore referred to as a skylight on good days and didn't refer to at all on bad ones. The whole structure sat at the edge of the meadow in the late October light, looking like something the wind had started to say and then forgotten. Rabbit stood before it for a long time. He thought about the frost that was coming and the weight of snow on a roof that could barely hold itself. He thought about the wind that came down from the north in January, the kind that found every gap and pried it wider. He thought about Eeyore, sitting inside that house in the dead of winter, cold and damp and too proud or too tired to say anything about it. Rabbit thought he was thinking about Eeyore. In a way, he was. But what he was mostly thinking about was the gap between how things were and how they should be, and how that gap was a thing he could not bear, and how the only way to close it was to do something, and how doing something was what Rabbit was for.
Eeyore,
Said Rabbit.
this house isn't safe.
Eeyore, who had been sitting nearby watching a cloud that looked like nothing in particular, turned slowly.
It never has been.
He said.
That's part of its charm.
It won't survive the winter. The joints are wrong. The whole south wall is bearing weight it wasn't built to hold. One heavy snowfall, and the entire thing comes down.
It usually does.
Said Eeyore.
And then I build it again. It's something to do.
But that's exactly the point.
Said Rabbit, and there was something in his voice now that was almost kind, almost pleading, and entirely certain.
You shouldn't have to rebuild it every time. If we do it properly, if we take it apart and put it back together with a real foundation, you won't have to go through that again. You won't have to sit in the rain waiting for someone to notice.
Eeyore looked at Rabbit for a long moment. Then he looked at his house.
I don't mind the rain so much,
He said. But Rabbit was already pulling at the south wall. It came apart more easily than he expected, a small, terrible fact that Rabbit took as confirmation and Eeyore received as something else entirely. The sticks came loose in Rabbit's paws with barely any resistance, as though the house had been waiting for permission to fall, and Rabbit worked quickly, the way he always did when he was sure, sorting the sticks into piles by length and thickness, discarding the ones that were rotted or too thin, keeping the ones that would serve a proper structure. He worked with his back to Eeyore, which was why he did not see Eeyore's face. It was not an angry face, that would have been simpler. It was the face of someone watching the one thing he had built, the one thing that was his to build and unbuild and build again, the one small exercise of agency in a life that mostly happened to him, being taken apart by someone who had not asked and did not look back.
There!
Said Rabbit, straightening up. He had made 3 neat piles. The foundation area was cleared.
I'll come back tomorrow with a proper plan. We'll have it right this time.
Eeyore looked at the 3 piles of sticks. His sticks, sorted by someone else's logic into someone else's categories.
Thank you, Rabbit.
He said, in the voice he used for everything, the one that made it impossible to tell if he meant it or if meaning it was simply too much effort to avoid. Rabbit walked home in the late afternoon light, his lists nearly complete, his basket empty of carrots, his mind already sketching a blueprint for Eeyore's new house. A real house, with proper joints and a roof that didn't leak, and walls that bore their weight equally. He felt the satisfaction of a day spent in necessary work. He had helped. The wood was more prepared than it had been that morning, and the fact that no one had thanked him for it, except Eeyore, whose thank yous were indistinguishable from his complaints, was simply the price of being the one who saw what needed doing. He passed Pooh's house on the way back. The door was closed. Through the window he could see Pooh sitting in his armchair, looking at the pantry, with the expression of someone who has lost something but isn't sure what. He passed Piglet's house. The windows on the south side were sealed. The north side was untouched. Piglet's curtains were drawn. He did not pass Owl's tree, but if he had, he would have heard nothing, because Owl was composing a letter about the sanctity of arboreal heritage that he planned to deliver in the morning. He did not go back to Eeyore's meadow, where 3 piles of sticks sat in the fading light, and Eeyore sat beside them, not building. Rabbit arrived home. His garden was in perfect order, the winter vegetables in rows, the beds mulched, the tools cleaned and stored. Inside, his lists hung on the wall in a neat column. His pantry was organized. His wood was stacked. He made himself a cup of tea and sat down in his kitchen, surrounded by order, and felt, without quite understanding why, that something was missing. He dismissed the feeling. There was still planning to do. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting the blueprint for Eeyore's house, and the feeling retreated to the edges of the room, where it waited. Outside, the 100 Acre Wood settled into the silence that comes after someone has moved through it like weather. Rabbit returned to Eeyore's meadow the next morning with a blueprint. It was, by any objective measure, a good blueprint. He had drawn it the night before by candlelight, working through 2 cups of chamomile and a sharpened pencil, and it accounted for wind direction, load distribution, drainage, and the particular angle of sun that the meadow received in winter afternoons. It had proper joints. It had a roof pitch that would shed snow. It had, in Rabbit's considered opinion, everything a house needed to be a house and not merely a collection of sticks pretending. He found Eeyore sitting where he had left him, at the edge of the meadow. The morning was cold. There was frost on the grass, and Eeyore's breath made small clouds that rose and vanished without comment.
Good morning, Eeyore,
said Rabbit, unrolling the blueprint.
I've drawn up plans. If we start with the foundation...
I moved them back,
said Eeyore. Rabbit looked up. The 3 piles were no longer 3 piles. The sticks had been rearranged, not into a house, but into a single loose heap, the way they had been before Rabbit had sorted them. The rotted sticks were back. The thin ones were back. The ones Rabbit had set aside as unsuitable were lying in the pile alongside the ones he had kept.
You moved them back,
Rabbit repeated.
They were in the wrong order,
Said Eeyore.
I sorted them by...
They were in the wrong order.
Eeyore said again, in exactly the same tone, which was the tone Eeyore used for everything, even, unsurprised, requiring nothing. Rabbit stood with his blueprint in the frost and felt something he did not have a word for. It was not anger. He understood anger, and anger had a shape, sharp, hot, quick to spend. This was different. This was the feeling of having done something correctly and having it not matter. He opened his mouth to explain about load-bearing capacity and the structural limitations of rotted wood, and then he closed it again, because Eeyore was not looking at him. Eeyore was looking at the pile of sticks with an expression that Rabbit, for the first time, could not read.
Right,
Said Rabbit. He rolled up his blueprint.
Well, when you're ready to do it properly, you know where to find me.
He left. But he left more slowly than he had arrived, and he carried the blueprint under his arm instead of in his hand, and these were small things that meant nothing to anyone who was not paying very close attention. The wood was quieter than usual that day. Not silent. The wood was never truly silent because there were always birds and wind and the small industrial sounds of creatures going about their lives, but quieter in the way that a room is quieter after someone has said something that no one knows how to answer. Rabbit felt this without identifying it. He attributed it to the season. Late autumn was a quiet time. Everything was preparing to go to sleep. He went to check on his work from the day before. Pooh's pantry was still organized. Rabbit opened the door and confirmed this. The pots were where he had put them, largest in the back, smallest in the front. The bird bath pot exiled to the corner. Everything was in order. Everything was correct. Pooh was in his armchair, doing nothing.
Pooh,
Said Rabbit, because the silence made him uncomfortable, and he had never been good at leaving things alone.
have you eaten from the front pots first, as I showed you?
I have been thinking.
Said Pooh. This was, in Rabbit's experience, rarely a productive activity for Pooh, but he waited.
I have been thinking
Said Pooh.
that the pot with the special honey, the honey from the bee tree by the stream, the one that tastes like summer afternoons, used to be on the left side of the second shelf, because that is where the light comes in. And when I opened the pantry in the morning, the light would come through the honey, and it would glow, and I would know which pot it was without looking.
Rabbit said nothing.
I can't find it now.
Said Pooh.
I expect it's in the back, because it was quite a large pot. But it doesn't glow in the back, because the light doesn't reach. So now it's just honey.
He paused.
It's still very good honey.
He added, because Pooh was not the sort of bear who complained about honey under any circumstances.
But it used to be that honey. And now it's just honey. And I have been thinking about the difference.
The thing Rabbit felt then was small and precise, like a hairline crack in a teacup, the kind you don't notice until you pick it up and the tea leaks through your fingers. Pooh was not accusing him. Pooh was not angry. Pooh was simply describing a loss so minor that it shouldn't have mattered, and Rabbit understood, in some part of himself that he immediately sealed over, that it mattered completely.
I'll move it back.
Said Rabbit.
Oh, you don't have to.
Said Pooh.
I just thought you might like to know about the glowing.
Rabbit moved the pot. It took 10 seconds. He placed it on the left side of the second shelf, where the morning light came through the window, and the honey caught the light and held it, amber and warm. And Pooh said,
There it is.
with such quiet satisfaction that Rabbit had to leave the room. He stood outside Pooh's door for a moment. The feeling was still there, the hairline crack, the leak he couldn't locate. He added it to the list of things he did not have time to examine and walked on. He did not go to Piglet's house. He had planned to, it was on the list, but when he came within sight of it, he saw that Piglet was sitting on his front step, and something about the way Piglet was sitting made Rabbit slow down. Piglet was holding the tin of putty. He had sealed 2 of his windows, the kitchen and the bedroom, with the careful, uneven work of someone who had never used putty before and had done his best. The other windows were untouched. He was sitting on the step with the tin in his lap, looking at the north-facing wall of his house, and his expression was the one he wore when something was too big for him, but he hadn't decided yet whether to say so. Rabbit watched from behind a tree. He had intended to walk over and inspect the work, perhaps offer corrections, perhaps finish the remaining windows himself. But something stopped him. It was not a thought. Rabbit's thoughts were still running along their usual tracks, assessing, planning, noting the unfinished windows with a small pulse of irritation. What stopped him was closer to a physical sensation, a tightness in his chest that arrived without explanation and would not resolve into anything useful. Piglet put down the putty. He looked at the sealed windows, then at the unsealed ones. Then he picked up the putty again and went to the next window. And Rabbit saw that his hands were shaking slightly, the way they always did when Piglet was doing something that frightened him, which was most things. Rabbit turned around and went home. He did not inspect the windows. He did not offer corrections. He did not understand why, and the not understanding was itself a new and unwelcome sensation, because Rabbit always understood why he did things. His reasons were his architecture. They held him up. And now one of the walls had a crack in it, and he could feel the draught but could not find the gap. That evening there was a knock at Rabbit's door. It was Pooh, holding a honey pot.
"I brought you this,"
said Pooh. Rabbit looked at the pot. It was small and slightly sticky, and the lid didn't fit properly. It was the kind of pot that belonged in no system and followed no principle of organization. It was, in short, a very Pooh sort of gift.
What's this for?
Said Rabbit.
"I thought you might like some honey.
Said Pooh.
You seemed like you were having a thinking sort of day, and honey helps with thinking. At least, it helps with my thinking, but my thinking is mostly about honey, so it might be different for you."
Rabbit took the pot. He was aware that this was a kindness, and he was aware that he had not earned it, and the distance between those two facts was the exact shape of the crack in the teacup.
Thank you, Pooh,
he said.
"You're welcome, Rabbit,"
said Pooh, and left, walking slowly through the garden in the way that Pooh walked everywhere, without urgency, without plan, as though the walking itself were the point. And Rabbit stood in his doorway holding a pot of honey he hadn't asked for, given by someone whose pantry he had rearranged without asking. And the evening was very quiet, and the garden was very orderly, and the honey pot did not fit on any of his shelves, but he put it on the kitchen table, where it sat, lopsided and sticky, and occupying space in a way that resisted categorization. He did not draft additional blueprints that night. He sat at his table with his tea and the honey pot and his lists on the wall and the feeling of a draft he couldn't find, and eventually he went to bed without having accomplished anything at all, which had never happened to him before, and which he decided, firmly, was simply tiredness. Outside, the 100-acre wood held its breath, the way a forest does when something is about to change but hasn't yet, when the first crack has appeared but the wall is still standing, when the wind has shifted but the leaves haven't moved. The storm came 2 weeks early. The animals of the 100-acre wood had their own ways of knowing weather. Owl claimed to read it in the behavior of clouds, though his predictions were wrong as often as they were right, and sometimes more often. Pooh felt it in his bones, which he said ached before rain, but which also ached after honey, so the signal was unreliable. Eeyore simply assumed the worst at all times, which gave him an impressive forecasting record. Rabbit read the barometer. He had acquired it the previous spring from a jumble sale in the village beyond the wood, and he had mounted it on his kitchen wall between the lists and the calendar, and he checked it every morning with the seriousness of a ship's captain. On the morning of November the 14th, the needle dropped so far and so fast that Rabbit tapped the glass twice to make sure it wasn't stuck. It wasn't stuck. The air pressure was falling like something that had decided to stop trying.
Early,
Said Rabbit to his kitchen.
2 weeks early.
He pulled on his coat and went outside. The sky was the color of pewter, not the dramatic purple-black of a proper storm sky, but the flat, featureless grey that meant the weather had settled in and intended to stay. The wind was already moving through the treetops with a low, continuous sound, like someone drawing a breath that never ended. Rabbit assessed. His own preparations were complete: garden harvested, wood stacked, pantry stocked, windows sealed, roof patched. He had done this weeks ago, because Rabbit always did things weeks ago. His house was ready. The wood was not. He went first to Pooh's house, walking fast, his mind already running the calculations. Pooh's honey stores, the ones Rabbit had reorganized, were in the pantry. The pantry was on the north side of Pooh's house. Rabbit had moved the largest pots to the back of the pantry, against the north wall, because that was where the most space was, and space was the organizing principle, and the organizing principle was correct. But the north wall of Pooh's pantry was also the coldest wall. the wall that the wind hit first, the wall that, in a proper winter storm, would drop below freezing while the rest of the house stayed merely cold. Rabbit had known this, he had known it, but the knowledge had been filed under temperature gradients on one of his lists, and the reorganization had been filed under honey storage, and the two lists had not spoken to each other, because Rabbit's lists were thorough, but they were not wise, and there is a difference between organizing information and understanding it. The large pots, the ones with the most honey, against the coldest wall, in a storm that was coming 2 weeks early, before Rabbit had planned to move them. He arrived at Pooh's door. Pooh opened it with the expression of a bear who has been interrupted mid-think, but is too polite to mention it.
Pooh,
Said Rabbit.
the storm. Your honey. I need to move the pots.
Oh,
Said Pooh.
I already did.
Rabbit blinked.
You what?
I moved them back.
Said Pooh.
Not to where they were before, exactly, because I couldn't remember where everything went. Except for the glowing pot, which you put back, which was kind. But I moved the big ones away from the back wall, because they were getting very cold. And cold honey is slow honey. And slow honey is sad honey. And I didn't want sad honey.
Rabbit opened his mouth and closed it.
Also,
Said Pooh.
I put the bird bath pot outside again, because it wasn't a bird bath before. But now there's a wren using it, and I didn't want to be rude.
Rabbit looked into Pooh's pantry. It was not organized by any system he recognized. The pots were distributed according to a logic that had nothing to do with volume or access frequency. And yet, the large pots were away from the cold wall. The small ones, which would freeze faster, were near the stove. The honey was, against every principle Rabbit held, better arranged than what he had done.
How did you know?
Said Rabbit.
About the cold wall.
Pooh thought about this.
I didn't know.
He said.
I just didn't like the honey being cold.
Rabbit left Pooh's house more slowly than he had entered it. He went to Piglet's house. The wind was picking up now, bending the smaller trees into bows that didn't straighten fully before the next gust pushed them over again. Leaves were moving horizontally. Rabbit leaned into the wind and felt it push back with a solidity that was almost personal. Piglet's south-facing windows were sealed. Rabbit had done those himself. The putty was even, professional, tight against the frames. They would hold. Piglet's north-facing windows, the ones Rabbit had assigned to Piglet, were a different story. The putty was uneven, applied too thickly in some places and too thinly in others, with gaps where Piglet's small, shaking hands had lost their grip on the tin. 2 of the windows were done, 2 were not. The kitchen window was sealed well enough, the bedroom window less so. The 2 undone windows faced directly into the wind. Rabbit stared at the north wall of Piglet's house and felt the full weight of what he had done. He had given Piglet a task. He had not taught Piglet how to do it. He had not checked on Piglet's work. He had not come back to finish what Piglet could not. He had assigned responsibility without support and then walked away. And now the storm was here, 2 weeks early, and Piglet's bedroom window had a gap in the putty wide enough to fit a finger through, and the wind was coming from the north. He knocked. Piglet answered. Behind him, Rabbit could see that Piglet had moved his bed away from the window and piled every blanket he owned on top of it. He had known about the gap.
Rabbit?
Said Piglet, with the particular brightness of someone who is frightened but has decided to be brave about it.
Isn't it windy?
Piglet,
Said Rabbit.
your windows.
Yes,
Said Piglet.
I did my best. I know the bedroom one isn't quite...
I should have come back.
Said Rabbit. Piglet stopped. This was not what he had expected. He had expected instructions, or corrections, or perhaps the particular sigh that Rabbit used when things were not up to standard. He had not expected Rabbit to say something that sounded, if you listened carefully, like the beginning of an apology.
Oh,
Said Piglet.
that's all right, Rabbit. You were very busy.
I should have come back.
Rabbit said again, and this time there was something in it that made Piglet look at him more closely, a roughness, as though the words had edges that caught on the way out. Rabbit sealed the windows. He did it quickly and well, because he was Rabbit and this was Putty, and he knew what he was doing with Putty, whatever else he might not know. When he finished, Piglet's house was tight against the storm, all four walls, all the windows, north and south, the work of two animals rather than one.
Thank you, Rabbit,
Said Piglet.
Stay inside.
Said Rabbit, and left. The storm hit in the early afternoon. It was not the gentle, blustery sort of storm that the 100 Acre Wood occasionally produced, the kind that knocked over a few branches and gave Piglet an excuse to hold on to something. This was a proper winter storm, the kind that came from the north with a sound like the sky tearing, the kind that turned the air white and made the world into a single continuous roar. The temperature dropped so fast that the puddles from yesterday's rain froze mid-ripple. The wind found every gap, every crack, every weakness and pulled. Rabbit was in his house. His house was ready. His wood was stacked, his pantry stocked, his windows sealed, his roof patched. The storm hit his walls, and his walls held, and the wind went around him, and his barometer dropped further, and his fire burned evenly, and he was warm and dry and alone. He sat at his kitchen table with his tea and Pooh's honey pot, still there, still lopsided, still on the table where no system had claimed it. And he listened to the storm, and he thought about Eeyore. Eeyore, who had no house. Rabbit had dismantled Eeyore's house. Rabbit had planned to rebuild it, properly, with a blueprint, with real joints and a roof that shed snow. But he had not rebuilt it. He had left 3 piles of sorted sticks, and Eeyore had pushed them back into one pile, and neither of them had built anything. And now the storm was here, 2 weeks early, and Eeyore was in a meadow with a pile of sticks and a wind that could knock down trees. Rabbit put down his tea. He stood up. He sat down. He stood up again. The thing happening inside Rabbit was not a decision. A decision implies alternatives clearly seen and rationally weighed. What was happening was closer to a collapse, the final failure of a structure that had been cracking since Pooh described the honey that used to glow. Every wall he had built inside himself, the wall that said, "I was right to sort those sticks," the wall that said, "Eeyore will come to me when he's ready," the wall that said, "I prepared and they didn't, and that's their responsibility." Every wall was now taking the full force of a single unbearable fact. Eeyore was in the storm because of him. Not entirely. Eeyore's house had always been fragile. The storm would have damaged it regardless. Rabbit's dismantling was not the only cause of Eeyore's exposure. But it was a cause, a sufficient cause, a proximate cause, and the difference between a cause and the cause mattered less than the wind outside, which did not care about causation, and was at this moment hitting the meadow where Eeyore sat beside a pile of sticks that used to be a house, that used to be his. Rabbit put on his coat. He opened the door. The storm hit him like a wall of moving ice. The wind was so strong that his first step forward became a half-step sideways, and he had to grab the doorframe to keep from being pushed back inside. The snow was not falling, it was flying, horizontal, sharp as sand, and the world beyond his garden was a white nothing, featureless and loud. He could close the door. He could go back to his fire and his tea and his organized pantry and wait for the storm to pass and deal with the consequences afterward, the way a sensible animal would, the way the rabbit of 2 weeks ago would have, because 2 weeks ago Rabbit's walls were intact and the draft had not yet found its way in. This was the moment. Not a dramatic moment. The 100 Acre Wood did not do dramatic moments, not really, not in the way that larger stories in larger places did. There was no audience, there was no music. There was only Rabbit in his doorway, in a storm, with his coat on and his door open, and the warm air of his kitchen escaping past him into the white roar of the world. He stepped out. He pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked, and the sound was swallowed immediately by the wind, and Rabbit leaned into the storm and walked toward Eeyore's meadow. He could barely see. The snow was so thick and the wind so constant that the familiar landmarks of the wood, the fallen log, the sandy pit, the old oak with the hollow, were reduced to shapes that appeared and vanished like thoughts he couldn't hold. He walked by memory and by feel, his paws in front of him, his ears flat against his head, the cold finding its way through his coat and into his fur and down to the skin underneath. He thought about his blueprint. It was on his kitchen table, rolled up, held with a rubber band. It was a good blueprint. It accounted for wind direction, load distribution, drainage. It had proper joints. It would have made a proper house. It was useless. The blueprint was useless because a blueprint is a plan for the future, and Eeyore needed something now, and now was a storm, and a storm does not consult blueprints. Rabbit had spent his whole life making plans for futures that arrived on schedule, and the future had arrived 2 weeks early, and his plans were on a table in a warm kitchen, and he was in a field of wind with nothing but his coat and his paws, and the growing, terrifying knowledge that he did not know what to do. Rabbit did not know what to do. This had never happened to him before. Not truly. He had been wrong before. His plans had failed, his schemes had backfired, his elaborate preparations had collapsed into the kind of comic disaster that the wood specialized in. But he had always known what to do next. There had always been a list, a revision, a new plan, a better approach. The engine of his competence had never stopped running, even when it ran in the wrong direction. It stopped now. In the middle of the storm, halfway to Eeyore's meadow, Rabbit's engine of competence seized, and he stood in the snow with nothing, no plan, no list, no system, no certainty. And the wind pushed him, and he pushed back, and pushing back was all he had. He kept walking. He found Eeyore by nearly tripping over him. Eeyore was lying in the lee of his stick pile, not behind it exactly, because the pile offered almost no shelter, but pressed against it in the way that an animal presses against anything solid when the world has become entirely wind. The sticks were scattering. The wind was pulling them one by one from the pile and carrying them away into the white. And Eeyore was watching them go, with the expression of someone who had expected this, who had always expected this, who had built his house knowing it would fall, and had sat beside the pile, knowing the pile would scatter, and was now lying in the snow, knowing the snow would cover him. Because this was what happened to Eeyore's things, and to Eeyore, and always had been.
Eeyore!
Rabbit shouted, but the wind took his voice and threw it somewhere else. He reached Eeyore and knelt beside him. Eeyore looked up. His eyes were half closed against the snow, and his grey fur was white with it, and he looked very small and very cold, and very much like someone who had decided that this was simply what was happening now.
Eeyore, we have to move,
said Rabbit, close to Eeyore's ear.
Do we?
Said Eeyore.
You can't stay here. There's no shelter. We need to get you.
Rabbit stopped. Where? Get him where? Rabbit's house was a 15-minute walk in good weather, and the weather was not good, and Eeyore moved slowly on the best of days, and the wind was strong enough to knock Rabbit sideways. Pooh's house was closer, but in the wrong direction. Piglet's house was closest, but Piglet's house was small, and the path to it went through the open part of the meadow where the wind was worst. Rabbit looked at the scattering stick pile, at the sticks that were left, at Eeyore lying against them.
Can you sit up?
Said Rabbit.
Probably,
Said Eeyore.
though I can't think why I'd want to.
Because I need your help.
Said Rabbit. Eeyore looked at him. The snow was falling between them, and the wind was pulling at everything, and Rabbit was kneeling in the cold, with no plan and no list and no blueprint, and he had just said the 4 words that Rabbit had never said before, not once, not to anyone, because Rabbit was the one who helped, and other people were the ones who needed it, and that was the order of things, and had always been the order of things.
You need my help,
Said Eeyore.
Your sticks.
Said Rabbit.
I need your sticks, and I need to know how they go together. Not my way, your way. You've built this house 100 times. I've never built it once. Tell me how the sticks go.
Eeyore sat up. It was a slow, effortful, Eeyore-ish sort of sitting up, as though gravity were a personal inconvenience that had to be negotiated with rather than overcome. But he sat up, and he looked at the remaining sticks, the ones the wind hadn't taken yet, and he looked at the space where his house had been, and something in his expression shifted, very slightly, from resignation to something else. Not hope. Eeyore did not do hope as a rule, but something adjacent to it, something like interest.
The long one goes on the bottom.
Said Eeyore.
It always goes on the bottom. It's the one that holds everything else.
Rabbit grabbed the long stick. His paws were numb, and the wind was trying to take it from him, and the snow was in his eyes, and he could barely hear Eeyore over the roar.
Now the 2 bent ones. They lean against each other, like this.
Eeyore reached out one hoof and positioned the sticks at an angle that Rabbit would never have chosen, too steep, too narrow, structurally unsound by any engineering principle Rabbit knew. But the angle caught the wind differently. The wind went over the leaning sticks instead of through them, and the sticks held, and Rabbit understood, suddenly and completely, that Eeyore's house had never been engineered. It had been felt. Every angle, every joint, every seemingly random arrangement was the product of 100 collapses and 100 rebuildings, and the knowledge was in Eeyore's hooves, not in any blueprint, and it was knowledge that Rabbit did not have and could not have invented. They built in the storm. It was not a house. There was not enough time and not enough material for a house. It was a windbreak, a shelter, a thing made of sticks and intention that blocked enough wind to make the difference between dangerous and merely cold. Eeyore directed and Rabbit built, and the building was clumsy and desperate and nothing like the neat, correct, orderly work that Rabbit had imagined when he'd drawn his blueprint by candlelight, and it held. It held. They pressed together behind the windbreak, Rabbit and Eeyore, shoulder to shoulder, the snow piling against the sticks on the other side, and the wind howled, and the world was white, and the windbreak creaked and flexed, but did not fall, because it was built the way Eeyore built things, not to be permanent, but to be enough. Rabbit was shaking, not just from the cold, from something else, the aftershock of the collapse, the strange lightness of having no walls left, the disorienting freedom of not knowing what to do and finding that it was possible to act anyway. He was sitting in a snowstorm behind a windbreak made of sticks that were in the wrong order, by every measure he knew, and it was the most competent structure in the 100 Acre Wood.
Eeyore?
Said Rabbit. Said Eeyore.
I'm sorry about your house.
Eeyore was quiet for a long time. The wind filled the silence.
It wasn't much of a house,
Said Eeyore, eventually.
It was yours.
Said Rabbit. Eeyore looked at him sideways, through the snow, with the expression of someone who has been offered something unexpected and is not sure whether to accept it.
Yes,
Said Eeyore.
it was.
They sat together in the lee of the windbreak, and the storm raged, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the wind wouldn't take, and because silence between two animals who had never understood each other was itself a kind of beginning. The storm blew itself out sometime in the night. Rabbit had fallen asleep behind the windbreak with his back against Eeyore's side, and sleep had come so suddenly and so completely that it was less like falling asleep and more like being switched off. He woke to silence. Not the silence of the wood holding its breath, which he had felt in the days before the storm, but the silence that comes after, exhausted, clean, total. The kind of silence that has been earned. He opened his eyes. The world was white. Not the violent, flying white of the storm, but a still white, a settled white, snow on every surface and branch and stone, the 100-acre wood transformed into a version of itself that was the same shape, but entirely different. The way a face is different when it's sleeping. Eeyore was still beside him. Eeyore was, in fact, still asleep, which was unusual because Eeyore generally woke before anyone else, believing that disappointment was best confronted early. His breathing was slow and even, and his grey fur was dusted with snow, and he looked, in the early light, almost peaceful, which was a word Rabbit had never associated with Eeyore before. The windbreak had held. Rabbit looked at it, really looked at it, in the thin morning light. It was a terrible-looking thing. The sticks were at wrong angles. The joints were not joints at all, but collisions, points where one stick leaned against another with no fastening, no plan, only the geometry of mutual support. One stick had cracked during the night and was being held in place by the two sticks on either side of it, which had shifted to absorb its weight without being asked to. The whole structure looked like something that should not be standing, and was standing anyway, out of what Rabbit could only describe, reluctantly, as stubbornness. It was the most beautiful thing Rabbit had ever built, and he had barely built it. Eeyore had built it. Rabbit had only provided the paws. He sat in the snow and looked at the windbreak and felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was a Rabbit feeling, the feeling of a completed list, the feeling of order achieved, and was not guilt, although guilt was nearby, and had been nearby since the moment he'd seen Eeyore's sticks rearranged back into their original pile. What he felt was closer to wonder, and wonder was so unfamiliar to Rabbit that he did not recognize it at first. He thought he might be cold. He checked. He was cold, but that wasn't it. He thought he might be hungry. He was hungry, but that wasn't it either. The feeling was something else, the experience of encountering a competence that was not his own, and finding it not merely adequate, but superior. Not in the way that made him smaller, but in the way that made the world larger. Eeyore stirred, opened one eye, looked at the snow, closed the eye, opened it again, apparently having confirmed that the snow was still there and was not going to be persuaded otherwise.
Still here, then,
said Eeyore.
Still here?
Said Rabbit.
Both of us.
both of us.
Eeyore considered this.
That's more than I expected,
he said, and sat up slowly, and looked at the windbreak, and something passed across his face that Rabbit had never seen before on Eeyore, a flicker of something that in anyone else would have been pride, and in Eeyore was closer to surprise at his own usefulness.
We should check on the others,
said Rabbit. They went to Piglet's house first because it was closest. The path was deep in snow, knee-deep on Rabbit, which meant nearly chest-deep on Piglet, if Piglet had been outside, which he had not. They found Piglet's house intact. The windows, all of them, north and south, had held. Piglet opened his door and looked out at the white world with the enormous eyes of a very small animal who had spent the night listening to the wind try to get in and had not let it.
Rabbit!
said Piglet.
Eeyore! Oh, I'm so glad you're all right. I was worried. I was very worried. I wanted to come and look for you, but the wind was... Well, you know how the wind was. And my door wouldn't... But I thought about you. I thought about you very much.
Your windows held,
said Rabbit.
Yes!
Said Piglet.
They did. Even the bedroom one, where my putty wasn't quite...
He stopped.
You came back and fixed it.
He said, more quietly.
Before the storm.
You did the other 3,
said Rabbit. This was, in the factual sense, not accurate. Rabbit had done the 2 south-facing windows, Piglet had done the kitchen window and the bedroom window. But what Rabbit meant, and what Piglet heard, because Piglet, despite being very small and very frightened of most things, was extraordinarily good at hearing what people meant rather than what they said, was that Piglet's work had mattered. The uneven putty, the 2 thick patches, the shaking hands, it had held, not because it was expert, but because it was done.
Would you like to come with us?
Said Rabbit.
We're checking on everyone.
Piglet pulled on his scarf. It took him 3 tries because his hands were still not entirely steady, and Rabbit waited for all 3 tries without saying anything or reaching over to help. And this restraint was not difficult for him in the way it would have been a week ago. It was simply what you did. You waited for people to pull on their own scarves. They went to Pooh's house next. Pooh's house was warm. Pooh's house was always warm, in the particular way that belongs to houses whose owners do not think very much about temperature regulation, but happen, through some alchemy of habit and instinct, to maintain exactly the right conditions for honey and for bears. Pooh opened his door and was pleased to see them, as Pooh was pleased to see everyone at all times, and he invited them in for honey, and the honey was warm because Pooh had kept it near the stove. Not the pots that Rabbit had organized, but a small pot that Pooh kept separately, the one he thought of as the emergency pot, which he had never mentioned to Rabbit because Rabbit would have wanted to organize it. They sat around Pooh's table, Rabbit, Eeyore, Piglet, and Pooh, and ate warm honey, and the morning light came through the window and caught the honey pot, amber and gold, and Rabbit saw it glow and said nothing.
Pooh,
Said Rabbit after a while.
your honey. Against the cold wall. I moved it there, and it would have frozen.
But it didn't,
Said Pooh.
because I moved it.
Because you knew.
Pooh considered this.
I knew about the cold.
He said.
I didn't know about the knowing. I just didn't want cold honey.
That's what knowing is.
Said Rabbit, and heard himself say it, and was surprised, because it was not the sort of thing Rabbit said. Rabbit said things like, the optimal storage temperature for crystallization prevention is above 4 degrees. He did not say things like, that's what knowing is. But he had said it, and it was true, and the truth of it sat in the room like the honey in the light, warm, plain, undeniable. Eeyore, in the corner, ate his honey slowly and said nothing, but his ears were forward, and forward ears on Eeyore meant listening, and listening was the quietest way Eeyore knew of being there. They sat a while longer, because the honey was warm, and the morning light was gentle, and there was no need, for the moment, to say anything at all. They went to Owl's tree after Pooh's house. The branch had fallen. It lay across the path in front of Owl's tree, enormous, its broken end white and jagged, surrounded by a spray of smaller branches and twigs, and the papery remains of a bird's nest that had been abandoned in October. The branch had fallen exactly where Rabbit had said it would fall, across the path, and it had taken a section of Owl's railing with it, and one of Owl's windows was cracked, and Owl himself was standing beside the fallen branch, with the expression of someone composing a speech about the unjust capriciousness of nature.
Ah,
Said Owl when he saw them approaching.
as you can see, the storm has wrought considerable...
Are you hurt?
Said Rabbit. Owl paused. This was not the opening he had prepared for. He had prepared for something closer to "I told you so," which would have given him the opportunity to deploy his prepared counter-argument about the historical significance of the branch and the unreliability of meteorological predictions. He had not prepared for "Are you hurt?" which was a question that required a different kind of answer.
I am not,
Said Owl with dignity.
though the structural integrity of my domicile has been somewhat—
Good.
Said Rabbit.
Do you need help clearing the branch?
Owl looked at Rabbit. Rabbit looked back. In the old days, which were really just last week, though last week felt like a country Rabbit had emigrated from, this would have been the moment for Rabbit to say something about having warned Owl, about the dangers of sentimentality, about the predictable consequences of ignoring practical advice. The speech was right there, fully formed, waiting in Rabbit's throat like a sneeze. He could feel every word of it. He swallowed it.
I could use some assistance
Said Owl, slowly, as though testing the weight of the sentence.
with the heavier sections.
They cleared the branch together, all 5 of them, because Piglet could carry twigs, and Eeyore could push, and Pooh could pull, and Rabbit could organize the effort, and Owl could direct from a position of supervisory authority, which was not the same as helping, but which made Owl feel that his contribution was managerial and therefore superior. It took most of the morning. The work was slow and clumsy, and occasionally interrupted by Pooh sitting down to rest and Piglet getting tangled in a branch, and Eeyore remarking that the branch was merely the latest in a long line of things that had fallen on or near him. Rabbit organized the effort. He could not help this. It was what he was, the way Pooh was a bear who loved honey, and Piglet was a very small animal who was frightened of things. But the organizing was different now. When Piglet struggled with a section of branch that was too heavy for him, Rabbit did not take it from him. He waited, and when Piglet looked up with the expression that meant, "I can't do this alone," Rabbit said,
I'll take the other end.
and they carried it together, and the branch was heavier than either of them could manage alone, and lighter than it would have been if Rabbit had simply taken it without asking. When Pooh sat down to rest, Rabbit did not tell him to get up. He let Pooh rest, and the resting was part of the work, in the way that breathing is part of running, not the running itself, but the thing that makes the running possible. When Eeyore pushed a section of branch, and the section didn't move, and Eeyore said,
Didn't think so.
Rabbit did not push it for him. He said,
Try from the other side.
and Eeyore tried from the other side, and the branch moved, and Eeyore looked at it with mild astonishment, and Rabbit felt something he had never felt before, which was the pleasure of someone else's success that he had not engineered, but only enabled. This was the breakthrough. Though Rabbit did not experience it as a breakthrough, he experienced it as a morning, cold, bright, full of work, shared. The breakthrough was not a moment, but a mode, a way of being with others that preserved his nature, organized, practical, purposeful, while making room for theirs. He did not stop being Rabbit. He stopped being only Rabbit. By noon, the branch was cleared, the path was open, and Owl's window was patched with a piece of bark that Eeyore had found, and that Rabbit had shaped, and that Piglet had held in place while Rabbit fastened it. It was not a permanent fix. It was not in the blueprint. It was a collaboration, imperfect and functional, and it held. They stood in the snow in front of Owl's tree, 5 animals in the winter sunlight, tired and cold, and not one of them alone, and the 100 Acre Wood stretched around them in its white stillness, and Rabbit looked at it and saw it differently than he had seen it before. He had always seen the wood as a problem to be managed, the disorder, the inefficiency, the maddening way that nothing was ever quite right. These were failures to be corrected, gaps to be closed, systems to be imposed. He had loved the wood, but he had loved it the way an architect loves a building, for what it could be, if only it were done properly. He saw it now as something else, not a building, but an ecology, a system that organized itself imperfectly and continuously through the interactions of its inhabitants. Pooh's honey instinct, Piglet's attentive fear, Eeyore's knowledge of sticks and wind, Owl's stubborn dignity. Even Rabbit's own need for order, all of it was part of the system, and the system worked, not because any single element was optimal, but because the elements compensated for each other in ways that no single animal could have designed. His garden at home was perfect. But a garden is not an ecology. A garden is a thing you control. An ecology is a thing you belong to.
Well,
Said Rabbit.
I suppose we should see about lunch.
Now you're talking.
Said Pooh. That afternoon, after lunch at Pooh's house, honey sandwiches, slightly uneven, entirely adequate, Rabbit walked home alone. The path through the wood was familiar and unfamiliar at once. The same trees, the same turns, the same landmarks, all of them softened and transformed by snow. He walked slowly, not because he was tired, though he was, and not because the snow was deep, though it was, but because he was not in a hurry, and not being in a hurry was itself a new experience that he wanted to feel the full shape of. He passed Eeyore's meadow. The windbreak was still standing. In the daylight, clear of storm, it looked even more precarious, a collection of sticks and angles that seemed to violate every principle of construction. And yet, the sticks that had been in the wrong order, by Rabbit's reckoning, were in the right order by Eeyore's, and Eeyore's order had held through the worst storm of the season. There was a lesson in this that Rabbit was not yet able to articulate fully, but could feel in his bones, the way Pooh felt weather, not as knowledge exactly, but as truth. Something about the difference between a system that is correct and a system that is alive. Something about the way that correctness, pursued alone, becomes its own form of fragility. He arrived home. His garden was buried under a foot of snow. Every neat row, every careful bed, every precisely placed mulch, all of it invisible under a single blank white surface. The storm had erased his order completely. Not destroyed it. The garden was still there underneath, and spring would find it, but covered it, temporarily, with something that did not care about rows. Rabbit looked at his buried garden, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel the urge to dig it out. He went inside. The kitchen was exactly as he had left it, the lists on the wall, the clean tools, the organized pantry, and on the table, Pooh's honey pot, still lopsided, still sticky, still occupying space that no system had assigned it. Rabbit sat down at his table. He picked up the honey pot. He opened it. He ate some honey straight from the pot with his paw, which he had never done before, because eating honey from the pot was disorderly, and honey on one's paws was unhygienic, and the whole business was really more of a Pooh sort of activity than a Rabbit sort of activity. The honey was very good. He put the pot back on the table in the exact spot where it had been, where it had apparently decided it lived, and he did not move it to a shelf. Three days after the storm, the snow began to settle. Not melt, that would come later, in December's brief thaw, or in the slow, reluctant spring that the 100 Acre Wood always seemed surprised by, as though it had forgotten that winter ended. But the snow settled, the way new things do. It compacted under its own weight. It found the shapes of the ground beneath it. It stopped being an event and became a condition. Paths emerged. Not cleared paths, no one had cleared them, but paths worn by use, by feet going back and forth between the same places, Pooh to Piglet, Piglet to Pooh, and Rabbit to each of them, daily, because Rabbit was still Rabbit, and Rabbit still checked. But the checking was different now. He checked on Pooh, and found the pantry in a state that was, by Rabbit's standards, moderately chaotic, and, by Pooh's standards, exactly right. And he said nothing about the chaos, because the honey was warm and well placed, and there was a wren living in the bird bath pot outside, and the wren was, if one was being honest, rather a nice addition. He checked on Piglet and found the putty holding all 4 walls, and Piglet had begun adding his own improvements. A draught excluder made from an old scarf, a shelf repositioned to block the cold spot by the bedroom window. Small, practical adjustments that were not in any plan and were entirely Piglet's own, and were, in their quiet way, the work of an animal learning what his house needed by living in it. He checked on Owl and found the bark patch holding, and Owl composing a monograph on storm damage that was factually questionable but emotionally sincere, and that Rabbit did not correct, because the monograph was Owl's way of processing what had happened, and processing was not the same as accuracy, and both had value. He did not check on Eeyore, not because he had forgotten. Rabbit had not forgotten Eeyore for a single hour since the storm, but because checking on Eeyore required something more than checking, and Rabbit was not yet sure what that something was. And for the first time in his life, he was willing to not be sure, and to wait until the not-sureness resolved into something he could act on. It resolved on the 4th day. Rabbit woke early, as he always did, and made tea, as he always did, and sat at his kitchen table, as he always did. The lists were still on the wall. He had not taken them down. They were still accurate. Things still needed doing. Winter was still here. The wood still required maintenance. But the lists had been joined, sometime in the last 3 days, by something that was not a list. It was a drawing. Rabbit had drawn it 2 nights ago, almost without thinking. It was not a blueprint. He had been very clear with himself about this. Blueprints were plans you imposed. This was something else. It was a drawing of Eeyore's house. Not the house as Rabbit would build it, with proper joints and calculated load distribution and a roof pitch optimized for snow clearance, but the house as Eeyore built it, leaning, improbable, the sticks at angles that defied engineering and obeyed something else. Rabbit had drawn it from memory, from the memory of watching Eeyore direct him in the storm, the long stick on the bottom, the 2 bent ones leaning against each other, the geometry of mutual support. It was not a good drawing. Rabbit's hands were better with putty and pencils than with art, but it was accurate in the way that mattered. It captured the logic of Eeyore's house, which was the logic of 100 collapses, and looking at it, Rabbit understood what he had to do. He finished his tea. He put on his coat. He picked up the drawing and folded it and put it in his pocket. Not to use, but to carry, the way one carries a map of a place one already knows by heart. He walked to Eeyore's meadow. The meadow was beautiful in the way that open places are beautiful after snow, wide and white and luminous under the low winter sun, the light coming in at an angle that made every surface glow and every shadow blue. The windbreak was still standing at the edge of the meadow, crusted now with ice and leaning further than it had the morning after the storm, but still upright, still holding, still testifying to a night when 2 animals who had never understood each other had built something together in the dark. Eeyore was beside it. Not inside the shelter was too small for permanent habitation, and Eeyore had been sleeping at Kanga's house, which Kanga had offered with the quiet, unsentimental kindness that was Kanga's way. But Eeyore came back to the meadow every morning, and Rabbit had not asked why, because some things did not require asking. Today, Eeyore was sitting beside the pile of sticks. The pile had been augmented since the storm, new sticks gathered from the fallen branch at Owl's tree and from the forest floor, added to the original heap. The pile was larger than it had been before Rabbit dismantled the house. Much larger. The whole wood, it seemed, had been contributing. Pooh had brought sticks from his walks, Piglet had carried twigs in careful bundles. Even Owl had contributed a section of his fallen branch, with a note attached explaining its provenance and structural properties. The sticks were in no order. They were in every order. They were in Eeyore's order, which was the order of a life that things happened to and that kept going anyway.
Morning, Eeyore,
said Rabbit.
Is it?
Said Eeyore.
I thought it might be. The light had a morning sort of look to it. But you never can tell.
Rabbit sat down beside him, not across from him as he would have in the old days, with the blueprint between them like a negotiating table, beside him, facing the same direction, looking at the same pile of sticks.
That's a lot of sticks,
Said Rabbit.
People keep bringing them.
Said Eeyore.
I haven't asked them to. They just appear. Like rain, but more useful.
He paused.
Slightly more useful.
Are you going to build?
Eeyore looked at the pile, then at the meadow, then at the windbreak, which creaked softly in the morning air.
I've been thinking about it,
he said, which from Eeyore was practically a declaration of intent. Rabbit reached into his pocket. He felt the folded drawing. He did not take it out. Instead, he said,
Would you like help?
The question sat in the cold air between them. It was not the same question Rabbit had asked in the storm. In the storm, I need your help, had been an admission of need, Rabbit's need, extracted by crisis. This was different. This was an offer, and the offer contained, folded inside it like the drawing in his pocket, an acknowledgement that Eeyore might say no. That no was a complete answer. That Eeyore's house was Eeyore's to build or not build, on Eeyore's schedule, in Eeyore's way, and that Rabbit's role, if he had one, was to be available, not to be in charge. Eeyore considered. He considered for a long time, long enough that a lesser animal would have filled the silence with qualifications or reassurances or a revised offer. Rabbit did not fill the silence. He sat in it. The silence was cold and the ground was hard, and his tea was at home getting cold on the table, and none of this mattered because Eeyore was considering, and considering took as long as it took.
You could hand me the sticks,
said Eeyore, finally.
All right.
Said Rabbit.
I'll tell you which ones.
All right.
And you won't sort them.
Rabbit felt the ghost of the old impulse, the twitch in his paws, the flicker of a categorization system, and let it pass through him like wind through the windbreak. Acknowledged, felt, not resisted, gone.
I won't sort them,
said Rabbit. Eeyore nodded. This was, by Eeyore's standards, an elaborate and enthusiastic expression of agreement. He stood up, slowly, with the careful deliberation of an animal who had spent several nights on Kanga's spare bed and was stiff in the cold, and walked to the pile of sticks and looked at it with the expression of an artist before a canvas, if the artist were very grey and very tired, and the canvas were a heap of sticks in a snowy meadow.
The long one,
said Eeyore. Rabbit found the long one. It was the same long stick that had formed the base of the windbreak, the one Eeyore had identified in the storm, the one that holds everything else. Rabbit picked it up and handed it to Eeyore, and his hands did not rearrange the grip or adjust the angle or correct the orientation. He handed it as it was, the way you hand someone something that belongs to them. Eeyore took the stick and placed it on the ground, not where Rabbit would have placed it, not where any blueprint would have indicated. He placed it where it went, according to a knowledge that lived in his hooves and his memory, and the accumulated experience of every house he had ever built and lost and built again. And the stick lay on the ground in exactly the right place, which was a place that only Eeyore knew. But it was different this time, different from every other house Eeyore had built. It was different because the sticks were chosen by Eeyore from a pile that was richer and more varied than any pile he'd had before, because the whole wood had contributed. Some of the sticks, the ones from Owl's branch, were thicker and stronger than any Eeyore had used before, and Eeyore placed them in the base and the corners, the places where strength mattered most, and the house was sturdier for it, without being less Eeyore's. And it was different because Rabbit was there, not building, handing. And the handing, the steady supply of the right stick at the right moment, without commentary, without correction, without agenda, made the building faster and easier and less lonely than it had ever been before. Eeyore placed the last stick. It was a small one, crooked, the kind of stick that Rabbit would have discarded as structurally insignificant on the day he took apart Eeyore's house. Eeyore placed it at the very top of the house, where it served no structural purpose whatsoever. It simply stuck up, at an angle, like a flag or an antenna or a statement of presence.
"There,"
said Eeyore. They stepped back and looked at the house. It leaned. It had a skylight. Its walls were uneven, and its roof was improbable, and the whole thing looked like it might fall over if you breathed on it too firmly, although both of them knew, Eeyore because he had built it, and Rabbit because he had watched Eeyore build it, that it would not fall. Not easily. Not in the next storm, or the one after that. It would stand because it was built by someone who understood falling, and understanding falling is the deepest form of understanding standing.
It's a good house, Eeyore,
said Rabbit.
"It's a house."
Said Eeyore.
"Good might be overstating it, but it's mine."
Yes,
Said Rabbit.
it is.
Rabbit walked home in the early afternoon. The sun was as high as it would get in November, not very high, but high enough to warm the snow's surface into a faint shine, so that the whole wood glittered, every crystal catching the light and holding it for a moment before letting it go. He walked through his garden gate. The snow was still covering his beds, still hiding his rows, still erasing his order. In a week, perhaps 2, he would begin to clear it. He would uncover his winter vegetables and check their progress and make plans for spring. He would do this because he was Rabbit, and Rabbit planned, and planning was good. But the plans would be different now, not because they would be less thorough or less careful, but because they would be made with the knowledge that a plan is a living thing, not a law, and that the best plans have room in them for what you didn't expect. He went inside. He hung up his coat. He made tea. On his kitchen table, Pooh's honey pot sat where it always sat, where it had sat since the evening Pooh brought it, lopsided, sticky, occupying its own unchosen, unassigned, perfectly right spot. Rabbit sat down with his tea. He looked at his lists on the wall. He looked at the drawing of Eeyore's house, which was still in his coat pocket, which he had not needed, which had done its work by being carried rather than consulted. He looked at the honey pot. He thought about the wood, about Pooh's pantry, warm and chaotic and exactly right, about Piglet's windows, sealed by 4 hands instead of 2, about Owl's patched window, held in place by bark that Eeyore found and Rabbit shaped and Piglet held, about Eeyore's house, leaning and skylit and alive with the knowledge of 100 rebuildings, about the windbreak still standing in the meadow, built in a storm by 2 animals who had stopped pretending that one of them had all the answers. He thought about his garden, buried and waiting. He thought about the long stick that goes on the bottom, the one that holds everything else, and how he had handed it to Eeyore without adjusting the grip, and how it had taken him all week to learn to do so simple a thing. He drank his tea. It was warm. The kitchen was quiet. The lists were on the wall, and the honey pot was on the table, and outside the window, the 100 Acre Wood went about its business in the way it always had, imperfectly, inefficiently, with great gentleness, and Rabbit sat in the middle of it, organized and particular, and a little fussy and better than he had been, and the afternoon light came through the window and caught the honey pot, and the honey glowed, and Rabbit watched it glow and did not try to move it to a more logical shelf. Outside, a wren sang from the bird bath pot at Pooh's house. Somewhere, Eeyore sat in his house, in the light from the skylight, not unhappy. And the 100 Acre Wood, which had never needed to be organized in order to be whole, settled into the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the silence of a place where things are, for the moment, approximately, gently enough.